Hello, I'm Gavin Clark, and I'm here with the National Museum of Computing at Bletchley Park. JavaScript runs more than 90% of the websites in the world's browsers and is among the programming languages that's most used by developers. It's not only changed the web, it arguably also made the web. It was born at the dawn of the web back in 1995, and it was created by a then hot new browser company called Netscape Communications. Don't forget, it's a long time before smartphones and native apps, when the browser was the primary way of accessing the internet. I'm talking to Alan Wirfs-Brock, one of those behind JavaScript, to learn more about how and why JavaScript emerged in those early days and what it's gone on to achieve. Alan is a languages expert who's worked as the project editor for ECMAScript 5 and 6, also known as ECMAScript 2015, and who's also worked at Mozilla and at Microsoft, amongst other organizations. Hi, Alan, how you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great.
Thanks for joining me. Now, let's cut straight to the chase. You described JavaScript once as unlikely to ever to be the world's best programming language, but its role on the web means that it's likely to become one of the world's longest-lived programming languages. What did you mean by that?
Sure. So JavaScript was created very early in the development of the web, and it basically was the first widely accessible programming language on the web. Before JavaScript, there was no procedural programming on the web. Basically, everything was done in HTML in a declarative style. But as people started trying to do more ambitious things in web browsers, there was a need to do some sort of programming on there. And so JavaScript was invented to be a simple language that could be embedded and become part of HTML, essentially combined in the same file, and which people without really any programming background could use. And it really introduced many people to programming on the web.
So it sounds like, in a way, it was designed to hide a lot of that initial complexity that it took to build websites and to programming on the web.
Well, it was designed to make the web more interactive. So while in HTML you could describe what a page looked like, it was you couldn't describe how, if the user did something, if they clicked a button or moved the mouse, what should happen. That had to go back to a server where a professional programmer would build a complex application to do that response. JavaScript lets the actual person writing the HTML code write some simple JavaScript code to do that response.
So it would happen all in the browser rather than going back to the server?
That's right.
In what way do you think it's going to become one of the longest-lived programming languages? What did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is, if you look at the nature of the World Wide Web, it's really become the repository of human knowledge. Almost all of the documentation that we create today gets expressed in HTML and other web technologies and stored in that way. And then a web browser has to interpret that for presentation. And much of what is created by that is created and just sitting out there for people to access in the browser. So there isn't a big staff of programmers necessarily sitting around to update existing web documents, making changes. So it has to remain stable. The browsers have to continue to be able to understand and interpret what's been written in all these documents, some of which were, even today, were written 20, 25 years ago. And many of them we expect to have value to people 100 years or who knows how long in the future. So, and that includes code written in early JavaScript. So that really has to be maintained for as long as we want these documents that were created in the past to be meaningful to people in the future.
Okay, well, let's go back to 1995. I think it was a radically different world as far as computing went then. A very proprietary world, very closed source world. Client server computing was huge. What was as a developer? Why was the world so complicated? Why was the world so complicated for developers then, and for trying to build and deploy code in a kind of a nutshell?
Well, what was you have to remember back then, the web for most people was at most like a year old. Yeah, it had been around, its early stages had been around for 2 or 3 years, but really any sort of broad exposure to people really started in 1994, and so in 1995 when JavaScript was invented, it was still brand new, and nobody at that time really understood or appreciated what the web was going to become. That was the same. 1995 is the same year Windows 95 was introduced, which was huge, and it was Microsoft Windows on the desktop was the focus of what computing was all about, and everybody actually thought because of that Microsoft would dominate all of personal computing, really all of computing for the foreseeable future. Yet the web was just kind of slipping in, and it exploded and stuff, but nobody knew where it was going. And so the problems with the web at the time was not that it was complicated, because it was actually quite simple compared to the web technologies we have today, but it was just that how would it work? How would people react to it? Who would write the web pages that people would access, and what tools did they need? And one of those tools that was in the first half of 1995 was clear that there needed to be some sort of browser-oriented programming language. And that's actually, let me just say, that's actually where both Java and JavaScript, which not coincidentally share part of their name, came into the picture. They were two different approaches. One was Java was a very professional-oriented programming language where you'd have to be a professional software engineer really to do anything with it. And JavaScript was a very simple programming language that the hope was that non-professionals could use it to create web pages.
Netscape was a very small company at the time, wasn't it? 3,000 employees, less than 2 years old. How did Netscape come to exert, which is long since ceased to exist? How do we think it came to have such a profound influence on the web through Brendan's work? What was it about the timing or the technology or the alignment of the planets that enabled it to be here long after this tiny company ceased to exist?
Well, really what it was that it's really Mark Andreessen, and that he and his co-founders at Netscape took an early Mosaic, which was an early academic browser that was created at the University of Illinois, and they put polish on it to commercialize it. One of Andreessen's main contributions was he introduced the image tag. He enabled pictures to appear on web pages and not just text. And then when they founded Netscape, they then very aggressively distributed their browser, the Netscape browser, essentially gave it away. And so it was absolutely the best way to browse the web for many people, essentially the only way to browse the web. So it very quickly, in the very early days, became the de facto standard browser. And much of what they did, much of the technologies they introduced, then became the de facto standard for the web technologies that anybody else who built a browser had to copy. And so they were the first then to say, we're going to introduce languages into it, and that kind of forced other followers to copy what they were doing, including Microsoft, who at this time realized that they needed to play in the browser game and were starting to very aggressively promote their browser, Internet Explorer.
What were the technology ingredients? Where did Brendan get his influences from, do we think? And were there, as often sometimes happens in programming languages, language creators take bits and pieces from other languages? Where did he get his influences from? Was it blank canvas, or did he draw on other languages?
Well, Brendan says that he was recruited to Netscape to implement the Scheme programming language as the scripting language of the browser. And Scheme is a variant of Lisp. And so anyway, it was a Lisp type language. That's what he thought he was going to do. But when he got to Netscape, Java, this interest in Java was also developing at the same time, and by the time he got started, it had pretty much been decided that whatever is done for a simple language, it had to have some family resemblance, or at least marketing resemblance, to what Java was doing and stuff. And so a Lisp-based language was just too extreme, too different to do that. And so he designed what seemed like a more conventional language, syntactically, in terms of the structure of statements. It looked more like Java, more like C, uses curly braces, not parentheses, to group things like Lisp and stuff. But it was very different from Java in the sense that it was a dynamic programming language. And from the scheme world, it borrowed the idea of first-class functions, which meant that a function you write could be treated as a data value and passed around as stored in the value of a variable, passed as a parameter, manipulated as a data value, which is a very, very powerful technique, and probably the key thing that enabled JavaScript to expand and do so much beyond what anybody expected it to do. Finally, it had the concept of objects, and this was in kind of the period, was the heyday of object-oriented programming. So it has objects, but it was, because it was supposed to be a companion to Java, it was a much simpler form of objects than in Java. It didn't have the concept of classes as such. It actually used what's called a prototypical inheritance rather than class-based inheritance. And to a certain degree, that concept was borrowed from the self-programming language, which is a variant of Smalltalk.